Hello and welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We do have a really great show for you. What do the Nazis and globalists have in common? Tonight's guest says a lot. David Hughes joins us. He's the author of Wall Street, the Nazis and Crimes of the Deep State. He says the same people behind the rise of the Nazis are the same people marching in a dystopian technocracy. He says the parallels between the Nazi regime and the new regimes we're facing are striking. David A. Hughes is about to join us. He has his undergraduate and master's degree from Oxford University and holds doctorates in German studies from Duke University and international relations from Oxford Brookes University. His research focuses on psychological warfare, 9/11, COVID-19, the deep state, technocracy, global class relations, and resurgent totalitarianism, which is what we're all watching happen in real time. He's got a lot of interesting topics. I'm sure we'll want to talk to him again about some other things. David, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, this is really this is you're like walking on hot coals, I feel like, with this book. Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State. I remember, I don't know if you're in the UK, so I don't know if you saw this on the news, but back during COVID, when Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was at a Defeat the Mandates rally, and he made the analogy or the correlation of the Holocaust and COVID passports. He was saying even Anne Frank, she could hide because back then it wasn't digitized, right? That was his point. And when he said even she could hide, that this, after he said that, even though those of us who heard him understood, there was a frenzy of people saying, how dare he compare COVID measures to Nazis, to the Holocaust? How dare he? How dare he? He had to come out and apologize. His wife had to make this statement saying, I was disgusted by his I mean, it was like a firestorm that came after him. And here you are writing an entire book about it.
That's right.
Wow. Okay. So let's make the comparisons. Let's start off with the Nazis. I think in order to get to where we're at today with the technocracy, the rising technocracy, the surveillance state, the censorship, all of the things that they're rolling out, the you will own nothing and you will be happy, right, agenda. In order to make the comparison of it to Nazis, I think we first have to understand the rise of the Nazis. And what most of us have been taught in schools is that the rise of the Nazis came after World War I, when the Germans, there was, heavy penalties after World War I on the Germans, and they got fed up, and it caused the rise of Hitler. And they started blaming all the problems on others like Jews or whoever. And that caused the rise of Hitler and the Holocaust. And we're also taught that the reason why there was then the rebuild of Germany after World War II was to prevent that same scenario that happened after World War I, to help the Germans after losing the war this time, in order to prevent that. But you say that's not exactly the story.
Right. So it's a complex picture. And I think you do have to be careful about how you present this material. I think leaping in kind of with 2 feet and saying that it's, this is like the Holocaust all over again is too simple. And it is a dangerous way to approach the subject matter. What I argue in the book is more nuanced than that essentially we are on a comparable historical trajectory, so that the political economy of the West since 2020 has demonstrated clear continuities with the political economy of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Now, that's before we get to World War II. It's before we get to the Holocaust. It's before we get to the war of extermination in the East and all of the medical experimentation and so on. But the point is, this is a similar historical trajectory, and we need to be wary of that because we do not want a repeat of the past. So is this a Holocaust yet? No, it's not. However, the warning signs are flashing red, and that's why I wrote the book. Now, in terms of the rise of Hitler, the argument that I make in chapter 3 of the book is that the rise of Hitler, the building of the Nazi war machine, and the entry of Nazi Germany into World War II would not have been possible were it not for the funding of Wall Street. And when you look at very powerful families like the Rockefellers and the DuPonts and the Fords of this world, they were all intimately involved in supporting Hitler and his inner circle, and in providing, for example, banking support through the Rockefeller Chase Bank in the Nazi branch in Paris, conquered France. They were involved in producing important war materials such as synthetic rubber and synthetic lead, without which the Luftwaffe couldn't have operated. And what's quite shocking about it is that while doing all of this, they were simultaneously restricting or denying supplies of the same materials to the United States. And so you see a complete lack of patriotic loyalty being involved here. It's all about money, power, and profit.
Why were they doing that? What was, so you just said that
Mm.
they wanted to make money. So they just saw more opportunity for money to be made in Germany than they saw here in the United States.
No, that's part of it for sure, but it goes much deeper than that. So the argument that I make in the book is that then, as now, we are entering into, or were entering into, a period of acute crisis in the capitalist system. So this, we have to remember, was all in the context of the Wall Street crash of 1929,
Mhm.
followed by the Great Depression, masses of people out of work, struggling to feed families. It was a system that wasn't working for the masses. And in that context, you have a real threat from a ruling class perspective of mass resistance and potentially even revolution. So it's in that context that we see the emergence of totalitarian regimes funded by Wall Street, and I should add the City of London, not just Nazi Germany, but for example, the electrification of the Soviet Union was being financed by Wall Street. And what's perhaps most shocking about this is that we mustn't forget that in the same year that Hitler came to power, i.e., 1933, very powerful industrialists and financiers in the United States were also bankrolling and sponsoring the so called business plot, which would have resulted in a fascist coup in the United States were it not for the intervention of General Smedley Butler, who was its intended leader. And so what we see is that had that been successful, we could have had totalitarianism in Nazi Germany, in the Soviet Union, across the United States. The whole world from that point could have turned totalitarianism. So the lessons of history, when you really understand them, is that for at least the last 9 decades, the ruling class has been willing to destroy liberal democracy, and its preference is actually for totalitarianism, which is the most efficient and most brutal means of keeping the working class in check.
Can you explain the near fascist coup that happened here in the United States?
Yeah, so this was across 1933 and 1934, and there were major names involved, like DuPont and Knudsen. There was a whole array of these very wealthy financiers, and they wanted to effect a fascist coup right at home. And again, when you look at the kinds of measures that these organisations and families were also involved in, use of kind of terrorist thugs to go through labour organisations and brutalise and intimidate workers and so on, we should be under no misunderstanding about the character of these actors and the kinds of vicious, ruthless, and brutal means that they will go to keep the working classes down.
But
So yeah,
how would have they done this? Like what was their end goal? What would it have looked like compared to where the US remained?
well, it would have looked like a consolidation of power for them. And again, this is one of the features of Nazi Germany as well, was that Hitler's regime was very good at suppressing the working and middle classes. So when Hitler came to power, the middle classes placed a lot of hope in him because of everything
Mhm.
that had happened during the Weimar Republic. And yet he favoured the big industrialist concerns. And under Hitler, a lot of small and medium sized enterprises actually went out of business. So it's about consolidating power in the ruling class. If we fast forward to 2020, what do we see again? A lot of small and medium sized enterprises going bust under COVID because of the legislation and the policies that were passed. Meanwhile, the mega behemoths, the Googles and the Amazons of this world, I think there was an estimated $3.3 trillion transfer in wealth that year globally from the working and middle classes to the transnational ruling class. So this is what it's really about. It's all about power.
Yeah. During the COVID pandemic, I think the worst thing that happened, there was a lot of bad stuff that happened, so it's hard to rank them. But the worst thing in my viewpoint with hindsight now that happened was this notion of disinformation and misinformation, and how they were able to. Now that notion was around before 2020, especially here in the United States after Donald Trump was elected in 2016. There was a lot of this, oh no, there's misinformation and disinformation coming from the Russians, right? All over the
Yep.
internet. It's the
Yep.
Russians doing this to us, and be wary, be wary. But with COVID, they were able to take what they claimed to be the science,
Yep.
and that rather than it just being bots, Russian bots they could never prove, or it being just political viewpoints that they didn't agree with, that's in the eyes of the beholder, when it comes to which political policies you think are better than others, right? But they were able to take the science and say, you're anti-science now. And
Mm.
so this is, and science is supposed to be black and white, right? In people's minds, science
Yep.
is truth or not truth. And so when people were, according to their propaganda, when people were denying the science, that I think really it turned this notion of misinformation and disinformation into a monster,
Yep.
from something small that people were on the lookout for to a behemoth that
Mm.
they now can weaponize with everything. And we're seeing that. They're saying, oh, you have misinformation or disinformation or malinformation for nearly every type of, whether it be protests and riots, or it be climate agenda, or I mean, anything they can name, they'll just that they just will say, "Oh, now you're just a bunch of disinformation or misinformation," right? So
Yep.
that to me, even though there was a lot of these, the rollout of a lot of the surveillance was really awful. The mandates, there were a lot of things that were really awful that I think marched in a normalcy that is incredibly dangerous going forward. But the way they get to the normalcy, this is why I say it's number one on my list. The way you get to normalizing surveillance, the way you normalize censorship, the way you normalize, oh, we need all of this to keep us safe. We need this tech and the surveillance and all of these laws now that we're passing to, we need this to keep us safe, is because of misinformation and disinformation. That's the what they're using as the reason. Well, we must, because there's all these bad actors out there spreading all this misinformation. So now we have to, we have to surveil. We have to shut down your bank accounts if you're one of these purveyors of misinformation, right? I mean, they've really weaponized that to a level that now they could use it for anything.
I agree 100% with everything that you've just said. I think C.J. Hopkins might as well. He's also written in his work about what he calls the new normal dictatorship in his context in Germany, of all places. And one of the points he makes is that you can argue perhaps with an ideology, but you can't argue with reality. And if you're told
Yeah.
that this is the scientific reality, this is the science, it's quite hard to argue with that. The irony, of course, being that the science with a capital T and a capital S and a trademark is anything but science. It's a pseudo scientific cult mentality.
Yeah.
And again, this is common to totalitarian regimes. They're premised on lies, they're premised on deception, and they are premised on a single version of the truth as decreed by the regime. So, in that context, it's no accident if we, for example, remember New Zealand Prime Minister, as she was then, Jacinda Ardern, when she said, "The government will be your single source of truth." This is how a totalitarian speaks. So, again, when you're talking about censorship and surveillance, this is all antithetical to liberal
Yeah.
democracy. These are all clear warning signs that we are heading in a totalitarian direction.
So it seems to be cyclical, is what you're kind of presenting here with in the 30s, the financial power players realizing that things were slipping and they wanted to somehow gain power. So they turned to totalitarianism and fascism in order to get control, in order to gain control.
Yep.
And you're saying it's happening again. It happened again during COVID. We saw a real stark example of that as well. So it's whenever these financial power players so explain this a little bit more
Yeah.
to us. how is it, what is it that's happening to them from their perspective
Yep.
that makes them say, oh no, we got to implement some sort of totalitarian regime in order to gain control back? And do they really, are they sitting in these dark, smoky rooms saying that, like, oh, we got to implement some totalitarianism and some fascism. We got to bring that in order to gain control. Or is it something that naturally, kind of walk us through
Yeah.
their thinking?
Okay, well, I would refer readers to an event that I did Saturday just gone called the Omni-War Symposium. Easy enough to find if you search for it. And near the start of my presentation, which comes at the start of that symposium, I get into precisely these issues. And so, what were the warning signs from a transnational ruling class perspective that the existing control system was entering crisis? Well, you've already mentioned one, in fact. The so-called Russian disinformation narrative, which emerged in 2016, 2017.
Yeah.
But as you say, this has been used as the pretext for censorship and information control. And that in turn reflects the fact that narrative control is being lost when you have to start resorting to censorship. So, after a decade and a half or so of relative internet freedom, in which citizen journalists and people on independent media and so on were progressively exposing the lies and untruths in official propaganda, after a while they felt the need to clamp back down on that. So that was one sign. Another sign had to do with the international monetary and financial system, particularly in 2019, when the governor of the Bank of England, as he was then, Mark Carney, told a collection of the most powerful actors in international finance at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that the existing international monetary and financial system, he said, the center will not hold. Okay, those were his words. And that was the same month that BlackRock produced its document dealing with the next economic downturn, which was basically saying the next time there's a major economic crisis, this system is finished. So, in their own words, they're telling us this. In terms of neoliberal economics, we're looking at a system by that point which is generating historically unprecedented levels of inequality. And another aspect of the control system, I would say, is the war on terror, not just in terms of wars abroad, but as a control mechanism at home through more authoritarian measures and so on. And what we saw between 2015 and 2017 was a proliferation of terror attacks, a lot of them focused on France. And previously, those terror attacks had been serving the purpose of getting populations to willingly cede their liberties in exchange for the promise of security.
Mm-hmm.
However, after 2017, what we saw were more and more protests beginning to build worldwide, assuming more socially progressive forms. And then in 2019, there were major social protests in 35 different countries. That's 1 in 5. So, across those kind of 4 key areas, the transnational ruling class must have been looking at that and understanding that the existing control system was basically no longer fit for purpose. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben argued as early as February 2020. He saw this and he said, what the pandemic is really about, be it real or faked, it doesn't matter. What it's really about is effecting the transition to a new control system, which I've argued in my work is technocracy, which is a bio-digital form of totalitarianism.
This sounds like, I mean, okay, I've got so many thoughts going through my mind right now. This sounds
Yep.
like, um, so this is like sort of like fending off the proletariat, right? Like, is that what you're saying? Is that the bourgeoisie, the elites, they're
There's well,
realizing,
yes. So there's a fundamental class logic, and when you think about it, the global population also since 1950 has gone from 1.5 billion to a reported 8 billion. So
right?
how do you control 8 billion people?
Yeah,
That's
especially when
tricky.
the pitchforks are coming. So the idea is they sense the pitchforks are coming.
Hmm.
They're thinking, "Oh no, we've got too much wealth. They don't have much. All the resources have been sucked up to the top, and here we
Hmm.
are,
Hmm.
and the pitchforks are coming. And unless we want to
Yeah.
end up without a head, we're going to have to do something to quell, and control the masses."
Yeah.
Is that what the idea, the
It is, and I can just
fundamental?
add a couple of statistics quickly on that. If you look at the World Inequality Report from 2022, um, which is co-authored by some esteemed academics, what you find is that the richest 10% of the global population controls 76% of the world's wealth. And yeah, the bottom 50%, so that's half of all of humanity controls only 2% of the world's wealth. That's the reality of the world that we're living in. So you can understand why that top 10% would be afraid. And then when you dig down into the data, you find that within the top 10%, most of it accrues to the top 1%. And within the top 1%, most of the wealth growth over the last 30 years has been captured by the top 0.001%. And so
Yeah.
it's an extremely lopsided system. And that's the reality of the class relations behind it. And that's why it's become a very precarious position for them now. And
Hmm.
they remain in a precarious position because in trying to introduce this new control system, there are huge risks entailed.
Yeah, this is why kings of the past were wise enough to implement jubilees, right? They were like, okay, we have to start. We have to forgive a bunch of debt, give a bunch of money. We have to do all of the, even it back out. Take the resource. It's like resetting the monopoly board a bit, right? Like,
Yeah.
could you imagine playing an endless monopoly game and the person who ends up owning the entire bank, just the next time you play, they still own the entire bank, and you never you never get
Well,
to reset the game.
this is, in a sense, that's exactly what they're trying to do, isn't it? Through
Yeah.
the technocratic vision and the Great Reset and Ida Orkin's 2016 message, "Own nothing and be happy." I can completely imagine this if they're successful. Yes, we'll all have universal basic income. It'll be wonderful. But in exchange for that, we'll have to accept the transition to central bank digital currencies and social credit scoring. And the price we pay is our freedom.
Hey guys, this was just a clip from a larger conversation that you can check out the whole show and get the whole conversation by going to kimiversonshow.com. That link is down below. That is where you can watch not only the full interview here, but also every Monday through Friday, there is a full 1 hour or more show that airs at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Go to kimiversonshow.com. That'll route you to where you need to be in order to catch that full show every weekday. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you then.